Listen, Brian Moriarty has come unstuck in time. Sharp words between the superpowers, tanks in East Berlin, and now, reports the BBC, rumors of a satellite blackout. It's enough to spoil your continental breakfast. Thus opens the prologue of Brian Moriarty's 1986 home computer game, Trinity. Trinity is a work of what its publisher, Infocom, sold as interactive fiction, a category of purely text-based games that invited the player to explore a world of locations, characters, and objects in order to uncover an underlying story. These games varied in their conventions, but here the player controls an apolitical American tourist holidaying in London at the outbreak of World War III. Moriarty explained the inspiration for this game in 2023.
Trinity came out in 1986. At that time, that was the climax of the Cold War.
Yes.
Ronald Reagan had basically bet the future of humanity on a fib. He had told the world, at the behest of Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, that we were developing a space-based defense system that would be able to knock out ICBMs during launch.
What if free people could live secure in the knowledge that their security did not rest upon the threat of instant U.S. retaliation to deter a Soviet attack, that we could intercept and destroy strategic ballistic missiles before they reached our own soil or that of our allies?
And Hollywood responded, and authors responded. Trinity was my response.
Nick Montfort places interactive fiction in the tradition of the riddle. As a player, you're presented with an imaginary scenario made of multiple parts, and are encouraged to explore its consequences until you discover a conclusion that ties those parts together. What makes a riddle like Trinity a product of its time is the subject matter and the game's command-input interface.
Trinity begins right here in Kensington Gardens. At each turn, the game tells me where I am and what I see.
A tide of perambulators surges north along the crowded Broadwalk. Shaded glades stretch away to the northeast, and a hint of color marks the western edge of the Flower Walk.
This description was inspired by J.M. Barrie. The game tells me that I'm on the western side of the Flower Walk, so it stands to reason that I can go east to see the flowers. I'll type in "go east."
Flower Walk. Gaily colored flower beds line the walks, bending north and west, filling the air with a gentle fragrance. A little path leads northwest between the trees. You can see a soccer ball, half hidden among the blossoms.
I can not only travel through the game world, but I can inspect and interact with it.
Look at Memorial. Your London guidebook warned you that the Albert Memorial was ugly, but nothing could have prepared you for this embarrassing spectacle. Take football. You take the soccer ball off the flower beds. Finding the exact words the game understands does occasionally lead to frustration, but the second-person narrative can be immersive in the style of a guided meditation. You are invited to imagine yourself in these situations, even when events take a turn for the fantastic. Brian Moriarty used this medium to send you skipping through time via an otherworldly field of supernatural mushrooms, always arriving right before the moment of an atomic detonation. You find yourself taking on the roles of engineer, saboteur, interloper, or spy. You are invited to explore an area, interact with its wildlife, and meet its people before the inevitable destruction. Trinity spends most of its time among the very things the bombs destroy. As children comparing notes on the game, we often spoke to one another about these moments as though we personally experienced them. This effect echoes what Marianne Hirsch calls post-memory, which is a second-generation communicated memory mediated by imaginative investment and creation. Moriarty was explicit in his desire to reinforce the public memory of the Cold War.
So I grew up in the nuclear age. We had the duck and cover exercises when I was a kid. The bell would be rung in the school and everyone would have to get under their desks. But, I remember that clearly. And so I grew up with the shadow. And people should remember that the shadow is cast over all boomers. Right. We all grew up with this existential dread. It was very real and caused real nightmares for me frequently.
Moriarty positions the game in the context of The Day After and Threads. But while those films portray the grim outcomes of a possible future nuclear exchange, Trinity focuses on the documented past. The explicitly anti-war project and its time slip framing puts Trinity in the tradition of Slaughterhouse-Five, but instead of a semi-autobiographical narrative, it is the product of historical research.
We didn't have the internet then, so I had to use other means, but I started gathering research material. And by the time I was done with Trinity, I had amassed a large collection, a whole library of books. And I had also gone to the National Atomic Museum at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque and Los Alamos National Laboratories archives. I went there to research the game. I wanted it to be accurate.
One of the researchers Moriarty worked with directly was Ferenc Morton Sass, whose book, The Day the Sun Rose Twice, came out just before Infocom greenlit Trinity as a project. Sass later argued that the 20th century American public interpreted news of atomic developments through the lens of comic books.
I think that the average American learned about subatomic physics and this incredible world that was evolving through Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon, who were popular newspaper comic strips.
Infocom could not rely on the player's home computer to display images with any fidelity, but the company had a long tradition of including objects in the game packaging to serve as paratext. Disk drives of the era were slow, and users had to wait a while before we could play the game. These objects filled the time between purchase at a retail store and the active beginning of play. Trinity included an introduction to the historical moments depicted in the game, styled as a mid-century educational comic book. In keeping with the era, the comic's dialogue is heavily expositional and repeatedly calls back to earlier panels with catchphrases such as, "It is my patriotic duty," or "It'll never work." The comic focuses mainly on the decision-makers in the nuclear arms race and gives glimpses of the context in which these decisions were made. But Trinity, the game, focuses on those who had no voice in the decisions of war or the development of the atomic age. One scene in particular takes you to the moments just before the Fat Man bomb explodes over Nagasaki. But if you do not act quickly, your character's origin as an ignorant American tourist becomes a problem. One teacher, a young woman, sees you standing in the sandpile and shrieks something in Japanese. Her companions quickly surround you, shouting accusations and sneering at your vacation shorts. You respond by pointing desperately at the sky, shouting, "Bomb! Big boom!" and struggling to escape into the shelter. This awkward scene is cut short by a searing flash. You cannot save the world, but in this scene you may be able to save one 5-year-old girl. The Montfortian riddle of Trinity includes some elements that need not be resolved during play. The scenes in Japan and Kensington Gardens include origami paper cranes as notable and essential items. To understand how these objects are relevant beyond the game's whimsical Wonderland framing, the player would either need to have already encountered a work such as Sadako and the Paper Cranes, or dive into the extensive bibliography printed in the manual. But even if the intertextual meaning of the crane isn't understood until years later, post-memory, created through repeated play, can give that later discovery a fresh sense of poignancy. 5 years after the publication of Trinity, Hall and Convis observed that historians took a more analytical and less ideological approach to teaching nuclear history than other departments. They left the question for our current era, and those after, to determine whether that was more or less effective than non-historians who, quote, self-consciously tend to insert themselves into the debate. If Moriarty called Trinity his response to the fib of the Strategic Defense Initiative proposals, what political argument against this does it make? He inserted one non-historical scene, set in a hypothetical future nuclear conflict. You find yourself floating in space, surrounded by a child's soap bubble. In this moment, you witness an SDI satellite destroying a Soviet thermonuclear missile below. While some of the USA's close allies were skeptical of the SDI project, many Soviet scientists and decision-makers saw it as a troubling escalation of the nuclear threat from the West. Soviet scientist Roald Sagdayev was famously quoted saying, "If Americans oversold SDI, we Russians overbought it." The debate in the West soon turned to whether or not a system such as SDI could keep the West safe from nuclear attack.
The President's own technical advisors make it clear that this proposed shield, after 30 years of development, would be exceptionally leaky, would let through enough Soviet warheads if the Soviets chose to attack the United States, to utterly destroy the United States, and perhaps to bring about nuclear winter as well.
Contemporary critics, such as Carl Sagan, analyzed and explained the expected flaws in the program in great detail, but they boiled this down to one message. Even if the technology succeeds, it'll never work.